Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show, a program exclusively designed to promote reproductive health awareness and discuss fertility preservation options. Here is your host, the Harvard-educated fertility specialist, Dr. Aimee.
She's known as the Egg Whisperer. Fertility expert Dr. Aimee Abazadeh.
And you have yet another success story
Just launched by an East Bay fertility doctor.
I have Dr. Lynn Curchoe on today's Egg Whisperer show, and we're going to talk about everything related to embryo making, and she's kind of a badass, and I'm super excited to have her with me here today. Let me just tell you guys a little bit about her. First of all, hi, Carol.
Hi.
Hi. So this is Dr. Lynn Curchoe. She's a reproductive physiologist. Her PhD research focused on animal cloning, and her postdoc fellowship focused on human embryonic stem cell research. Say that 10 times. Human embryonic stem cell research. That's amazing. Her previous startup experience includes being the founder and CEO of 32 ATPs, where she applied her knowledge of biochemistry and biotechnology to the field of renewable energy, creating a patented biological supercapacitor. I mean, there should be like a show about you. I just want to follow you around with a GoPro. She's the founder of Art Compass, A-R-T Compass, and she's going to tell us more about that. It's a mobile application platform for IVF cycle management. Carol, how did you get to be so awesome?
Well, I'll tell you, it was a long, winding path. My mom actually was a single mom that had 5 kids, and I did not make it through high school. So I have a GED, but I had some excellent mentorship. I went to a community college, got an associate's degree in biology, transferred to the University of Connecticut, had amazing teachers at both places. I'm incredibly proud to be a Husky and to be a native of Connecticut and to have gone to Manchester Community College. They recently actually honored me with the Alumni of the Year Award, which just blew me out of the water. And really just such a nice foundation from a state where girls are really expected to make something of themselves. So even though my background was sort of inauspicious, you know, I come from a cattle town. Sometimes we say more cows than people. And I got to the University of Connecticut. I wanted to do high-tech science, but I ended up being right back with those cows in the biotech lab doing the cow cloning. Mm-hmm. So I had just an amazing graduate advisor there. She was the person who got me into graduate school. I didn't know anything about having a PhD or being a doctor or having an advanced degree at all. And so, yeah, it was just, it really was, you know, a series of very fortunate events for me.
So then how did you get from cows to humans? How did that transition happen?
So after I did cattle cloning in my graduate work, I went into the human embryonic stem cell model. So a human embryonic stem cell comes from an embryo, and it's a cell that can become anything in the body, as I'm sure you know, but maybe some of your listeners don't. So when you're an embryo, all of your cells are exactly the same, but then as you grow and differentiate, you go on to have a heart and lungs and a liver. And so what we were doing is we were trying to create the nerves that go to your peripheral nervous system, so your sense of touch, taste, smell. And that was kind of my first stop off after cloning, which is a form of reproduction. Into creating those human cell lines. Then I went to administration, where I was overseeing a department that had a lot of very high-tech labs, including biorepositories where they were freezing tissues. Mm-hmm. And eventually I took a detour into politics, where I was actually the governor of Utah's science advisor. And I worked on a huge project there. It was a $10 million allocation from the Utah State Legislature to get the STEM Action Center up and running. Mm-hmm. And so after that, that was when I did my startup, where I applied everything that I learned from the previous, you know, freezing of tissues and growing cells and doing science to trying to create this biological supercapacitor. So that was an energy device, kind of like a battery. That's what a supercapacitor is. If you think of the old style cameras, you used to hear a whirring as the flash charged up. And would go off. That's a supercapacitor. So it holds a lot of energy, but it releases it very quickly. So what we were trying to do was do that in a green way that didn't require the toxic components of batteries. So we wanted to make a supercapacitor that was essentially a cell. We used sugars and enzymes just the same way your cells do to create energy, and we did that in an electrical device.
And this was while you were working for the government in Utah?
That was after, right after.
Got it. I was like, what are they doing dealing with supercapacitors? Okay, got it.
Utah had a whole bunch of programs that were aimed at clean energy and startups and entrepreneurs. So I kind of got in through that channel. But basically, what ended up happening was my supercapacitor project brought me back to San Diego, where there was a clean energy cluster. And right as I was wrapping up that project, we got the patent was granted and the prototype was created, and we were kind of wrapping that up. I became pregnant with my own miracle baby. And as I was gestating her for, only 8.5 months, because we had a bit of complications there, I realized that I needed a career that I could leave my miracle baby every day for. And I also wanted to apply all of the science that I acquired throughout the years to, getting other women and other people the same thing that I now had. And I just knew that I had to go into embryology. So at the age of 37, with an 8-week-old baby, I basically started a brand new career. And the field of embryology has a very long, slow learning curve because it is so highly technical, and it really depends on your technical skill. And so I was just at the bottom rung of the ladder as, a worker bee trying to learn the field of embryology. But I just knew that it was something that I had to do. And I'm so glad I did it. I wish I'd done it earlier. I love this as a career. It is just the best thing I've ever done out of all of those things that I've done.
Yeah. So, it sounds like it's fun. It's not work, because when you love what you do, it's really a joy to go to work every single day.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you mentioned.
No, you. A component of each one of those careers that I had. That at the time I wasn't really sure, why was I going from one thing to the other?
Right.
But really, everything from freezing of tissues to growing cells to working with eggs when I was doing the cloning, and the genetics aspect of it that I did in grad school, all of that goes into the field of human embryology.
Yeah. You mentioned something, and if you don't mind, I'd love to hear more. You mentioned something about your pregnancy, and can you just share a little bit about your personal journey as well? Maybe someone who's watching can learn from it.
Yeah, I would love to. So, like so many women nowadays, I waited until I felt like I was in a really good point in my career to have a baby. And it did become a little bit like, okay, it's now or never. I was getting into my late 30s. My whole life, I had been focused on preventing pregnancy. So for 15 years, I was on the birth control pill, and a lot changed in my body over that time. When I went off my pill, it took me years to get back a cycle. And I had something called lean phenotype PCOS. So I had some kind of insulin metabolic processing problem that was causing me to not ovulate. In fact, I didn't even get a period. So I embarked on a plan of aggressive carb cutting. I cut out all the wine, all the refined carbohydrates, really tried to get it down to that under 1 serving a day that they recommend. I was actually very skinny now at this point. So my doctor wanted me to try metformin. For some reason at the time, I didn't want to do it, which now looking back on it, I wish that I had. I also did try some cycles with Clomid, and I actually eventually gave up because my insurance didn't cover IVF, and it didn't cover seeing the reproductive endocrinologist that I needed to see. So I was really not under the care of a fertility specialist, but I maybe should have been for my lining, because my lining, because I wasn't getting periods, my lining wasn't that thick, you know. And so my daughter ended up having not a great placenta, not a good placental attachment, and her cord was very stiff, so the flow of blood through it was
so there was some resistance.
There was. So she ended up having intrauterine growth restriction, and you know, possibly a factor of age, health, nutrition, all of those things. But really, you know, I do wish that I had been under the care, because we ended up having to induce early because her kidneys were not making amniotic fluid anymore. And there was, you know, I was so small. So all of those things that people are supposed to do, like come up to you and say, oh, what are you doing? Congratulations, and all of those things. I mean, really, it was almost like you couldn't even tell that I was pregnant.
Wow.
She ended up being just a smidge over pounds, which was actually really good.
Wait, did you say 1 pound? 1 pound? 5 pounds. Okay. 5 pounds.
Yeah. So
good. Well, and how old is she now?
She's 3 now.
3. That's an awesome age. That's an awesome age. So now I want to hear more about, you know, what you do now day to day. So now you're a senior clinical embryologist. What does that look like for people who are listening? Like literally from the time you wake up until the time you leave work?
Yeah. So usually the first thing I do when I get in the morning is I do the quality control in the lab. So I run through it and make sure that all of the instruments are functioning within the correct parameters. What we're trying to do in the lab is replicate the fallopian tube. So literally a human organ, we are trying to replicate the environment of a human organ in the lab. So everything has to stay within a certain humidity, a certain pH, a certain temperature. And that's going to be where the study of fertilization takes place in the lab. So I get in the morning and I do all the quality control checks, make sure that the incubators are functioning properly. And then usually we launch straight away into egg retrievals. I love egg retrievals because that's what's starting it off for my patients on their cycle, on their journey. And so after the egg retrievals are done, usually what happens is somebody else is thawing embryos in the lab and somebody else is biopsying embryos at the same time. So all of those things need to happen in the morning, and then usually the embryo transfers happen in the afternoon. The cells that got biopsied get packed up and shipped off in the afternoon, and then we are also taking those eggs that we collected in the morning. We're also processing the sperm at the same time, and then creating the embryos later that day.
And which lab do you work in right now? Where are you located? For those of you guys who are joining us, I have Dr. Lynn Curchoe. She's a senior clinical embryologist. She's coming to us live, and we're just having some technical issues at this point in time. You gotta love it. Let me just think. Hi, Carol. Hi, Carol. You just froze for a second there. You just froze for a second there. I was just asking you, where do you do your embryology work?
Yeah, so right now, and obviously what I do on my own time is not connected, but I'm at CCRM in Orange County.
Beautiful, 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 beautiful. So what I'd love to do is ask you a series of questions related to embryology that I know that patients, you know, everywhere would just learn so much from. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely.
Okay, here we go. Does ICSI really cause birth defects? What do you think?
Ooh, so this is a good question. It's a little bit esoteric and academic. So the question really comes down to, are people who are undergoing fertility treatment and need ICSI, are they healthy or are they passing something along that's causing birth defects? And so far, we haven't had very good clinical studies to help us tease out those effects. But what we do know is that there is a small elevated percentage of maybe cardiac defects, maybe epigenetic defects, and possibly some congenital defects. But we don't know what is exactly causing that. We don't know if it's the culture environment or if it's because somebody is being treated for infertility, so they are passing on a problem. We don't know if it's, simply just from culturing embryos outside of the body. We don't have enough information yet.
And I'm glad you put it that way, because that's basically exactly what I tell my patients too. We don't know if it's the actual procedure itself or the fact that someone actually needs, ICSI to get pregnant, and maybe there's a genetic predisposition to have a slightly, and we're talking about slight, increased risk of birth defects. Great. What about assisted hatching? Does that harm embryos?
It does not harm embryos. So there's 2 times we do assisted hatching in the lab. One is on day 3, typically around day 3, I should say. And on day 3, the embryo is made of cells that look kind of like this. So there's a space in between the cell border. And that's where we take the laser and we hatch right in that space in between the cells. So we're not hitting the cells at all. Then the other time we do assisted hatching is usually after we thaw the embryo before transfer. And if an embryo is in its zona and the zona is thick and it's in there all the way, we really do want to assist that embryo to help get it out of the zona, because it needs to do that to implant in the uterus. And when we freeze the embryos, it's shrunken down, and the zona, there's a space between this membrane around the embryo and the embryo itself. And so we take the laser and we go over the zona, and we're not anywhere near the embryo itself. So unless you have somebody who's not skilled at all using the micromanipulator, you're not going to be damaging embryos by doing assisted hatching.
Beautiful explanation. I mean, what I tell patients is basically like, if you need to have your appendix removed, you have to have the surgery part, right? I mean, you can't do assisted hatching, or you can't, let's say, biopsy an embryo without hatching it first. Would you agree? I mean, it would be impossible.
It would be impossible.
It would be impossible.
It would be mainly because, a lot of why people are being treated is because their embryos are slow growing. So it is possible in a very young, healthy person with young, fast growing eggs and embryos to have a fully hatched or hatching embryo on day 5 or 6. And that would be, we would kind of see that in patients who maybe were using an egg donor, or they were doing ICSI and IVF just for gender selection and family balancing, and they just wanted the PGT. But other than that, they were young and healthy. But even then, the majority of embryos are not going to be hatching on day 5 on their own.
Right. And do you do a lot of PGT in your lab?
So I can't really answer questions about my lab specifically, but I can talk in general about the field.
Absolutely. So I guess my question would be, if it were you knowing everything that you know, would you feel that PGT is a safe procedure?
Absolutely. So I would say that, in 99.9% of cases, PGT is absolutely safe. Now, I think in the field, we're using it on 80 to 90%, I would say, of IVF cases. And I do think, there is a ton of controversy around PGT, its uses, its benefits, and it's so clinic specific, really clinic to clinic on whether it's improving the rates. It's really confounding the data when you start to put it all together from all these different clinics and try to answer the question, is this good for any patient undergoing IVF? So I don't know if anybody does have this question out there, but if they're asking themselves, should I do PGT? They really need to decide in conjunction with their clinic.
Absolutely.
And they looking at their clinic's pregnancy rates for people in their age group with their indication, and to try to see if it's helping the patients.
Right. I mean,
the closer you get to 40, the more embryos you have that are going to be chromosomally abnormal.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the thing is that if your doctor is discouraging you from doing it, there's a reason why. They know what's going on in their lab, and clinics who have, the highest tech equipment and the best trained embryologists. I think of embryologists as if they're pediatric surgeons, right? So you have to have the skill set in order to do this procedure so that you're not damaging embryos. And that's really, really important. So asking the questions as to who is actually doing the biopsy on my embryos, what is their training, what is their background, how long have they been doing it, I think is a very fair question to ask before you embark, on an IVF cycle journey. So that's what I know you and I would probably do if it were us, knowing everything that we knew if we were to do IVF.
And
so, yeah.
I was going to say, so embryology has this really, really long training period. The biopsy procedure is the last thing you learn. And it really does take years of clinical competencies building on each other to get to that point as an embryologist, because there's so much more that goes. You have to look at the embryo and decide which chunk of cells to surgically remove with a laser. And that judgment takes a long time. It's not just, can you remove a little clump of cells without damaging the embryo? And then there's also this whole chain of custody that happens. So each chunk of cells has to stay with the number of that embryo, because the embryo is going to be frozen away and put away, and the chunk of cells needs to be sent off to the genetic testing company, and it has to correspond back exactly.
Right.
So it definitely, I think within the field of embryology, we have our own internal standards for training, and it's really very strict, and it's very hierarchical.
And you've you've also spent time working on a technology that addresses that too. Can you tell us about the Art Compass app that you have?
Yeah. So when I first started in clinical embryology at 37 in a brand new field, but being highly educated, having a PhD, one of the things that was a bit frustrating to me was, how could I know what clinical decision to make? And there really was no good way to know except by sitting directly with an embryologist and trying to absorb their knowledge from 20 or 30 years in the field. And I felt like there had to be a better way to train the next generation. So for our app now, when you look at it, you're like, oh my gosh, it does 15 different things. Right. It's a patient portal, MD portal. It's for the administrators, they can see all of these statistics that are related to their practice for success rates. And, the doctors can have the cryostorage inventory in their app. They can see exactly all the details of their patient's cycles. But it started off as one humble module for embryologist competency training. And it grew from there as my own training increased, and I saw all these different areas that could be digitized. And then sort of here we are at the end of the journey where MDs and patients were wanting this access to the same information. And so it's very role-based, so you only see what is relevant to you, and and it's very comprehensive for labs.
Awesome.
This whole suite of quality control tools, as well as delivering those PGT results. And patients can see the images of their embryos, which they love.
They love it. Everyone asks me, and I love to be able to give it to them. Yeah. Okay, so for those of you who are joining us and haven't started off with this show from the very beginning, this is Dr. Lynn Curchoe. She is a senior clinical embryologist at a top-notch lab here in California, and I'm so excited to have her on our show, and I'm going to ask her some more questions that I know a lot of you probably have related to what goes on in the embryology lab. So the next question I want to ask you, and for those of you who don't know, there is something out there, it's called non-invasive PGT, and we're going to be hearing more and more about that probably in the next year to 5 years. Can you just tell our viewers what that is and what you think about it?
Sure. So I just want to start by saying non-invasive means that, the conventional way to do PGT is that you're plucking some of those cells off the embryo. What non-invasive means is that you're not doing that. So there's a couple different techniques. The embryo is full of fluid. And so in one of those techniques, you're actually taking some of the fluid itself from the embryo and you're leaving the cells. And in the other one, you're taking the culture media, which is all of the sugars and water and all of the food that the embryo eats, and you're taking the culture media and analyzing it. So I think that these are technologies that are maturing, and they definitely are going to impact the field at some point, because I know every embryologist I know, we love PGT for the results that it gives, but we dislike, we've grown that embryo for 5 or 6 or 7 days, and we've taken care of it like it was our own live child.
Yeah.
Over the weekend, over holidays. We know that these are our patients, maybe sometimes last or only hope. Some of our patients are, undergoing chemotherapy and, and or the last chance IVF. I mean, there's just so many reasons, right? So I know a lot of people who really don't like plucking a few cells, even though those are coming from the home around the embryo, which is the layer that will become the placenta. And we know that it's not damaging the embryo and all of those things, but it just, it just doesn't feel like amazing to, it's like pulling hairs out of a child. Who would do that?
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, I say a special prayer and do my little dance before every egg retrieval. It's the same thing for you. I mean, I would love to be able to be like, for what we do for men, for women, be like, here's a cup, give me your eggs, right? So I imagine that's pretty similar to what you guys do. It would be great to retrieve cells for PGT without doing the biopsy. And same for me. I'd love to be able to help women freeze their eggs without doing an egg retrieval. So I totally get that.
The other aspect of it is, like you were saying, that we are just plucking a few cells. So
Right.
it doesn't give us the full picture. And so as these technologies are maturing, I think what we're hoping to see is that the technology of PGT, and maybe some of the reason for all this discord in the field and disagreement about whether PGT is effective or not, can kind of be solved by us getting more information from the whole embryo instead of just those few cells from that trophectoderm layer.
And I think that actually that leads into my next question about mosaic embryos and how you would feel if you, I mean, I know I'm asking you very personal questions, so feel free to decline. If you only had one embryo and it was mosaic, let's say for a high priority embryo to transfer, I won't call out any chromosomes here, would you feel comfortable transferring it with everything that you know?
I would transfer it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think that, so, okay, the field of embryology, 40 years old. We know, I want to say, if you look at a long timeline of the world, we know almost nothing about this very young science. Even for all we know, it's a drop in the bucket of all that there is to know.
Right.
And, there's so much discussion about in the early embryo. It's almost like when you write a first draft. You want to write that first draft to get the structure of your article done or your paper, but you have maybe sacrificed the exact wording, or the, some words might be spelled wrong, some grammar might be awkward, and it's kind of that same way with the early embryo too. And in the end, that might actually be more normal than we know. And we certainly do know that as you as you grow in the womb, and as you live your life, and your genome does change. It changes in response to what you eat. It changes in response to what your grandparents went through before you were even a twinkle in anybody's eye. The human genome is not immutable. It changes. Right. And so, I think there's a lot of evidence now from papers that have been published showing the success rates of mosaic embryos. It can vary depending on the exact chromosomes that are mosaic, or how many of the cells are mosaic. But, the way that I always tell my patients to think about it is an embryo is like a soccer ball. It has black spots and white spots. And when we're taking the biopsy, if we take it all from one color spot, that can generate a false positive, it can generate a false negative, or it can generate this result if we take it right from the border of a mosaic result. So you have to also think, we're only taking 5 cells. If one cell is different out of the 5 cells, that will be called a normal embryo. If
Mhm.
2 cells out of the 5 cells are different, or let's say instead of a 5-cell biopsy, we took a 4-cell biopsy and 2 of those cells are different, suddenly that's 50%.
Mhm.
And your genetic testing lab might call that mosaic, or it might call that abnormal.
Mhm.
But if we had taken a bit bigger of a biopsy, let's say we taken 7 cells and 2 of them were abnormal, that would put your embryo back in that normal territory, or that low mosaic territory.
Right.
So I think that in terms of an order for ranking the embryos for transfer, what I want to do is get my patients pregnant quickly.
Mhm.
So I'm going to pick the best looking embryo that is the biggest, because that gives us an indication of its metabolic health. So I'm going to pick the most expanded embryo that has the least amount of fragmentation and has a PGT score of being normal.
Mhm.
But I'm putting all that information together to take the embryo to transfer first. In the case where there's only 1 or a few embryos to transfer, everybody has seen an embryo that didn't thaw well, was 3B minus, B minus, was, the frozen 20 years ago under, methods that aren't even in existence today. We have all seen those kind of embryos become babies. So I'm always on the side of transfer.
Right. Right. So basically what you're saying is that embryo quality really does matter, but sometimes the ugliest embryos can turn into the most beautiful babies.
That is so true.
Yeah.
You gave me chills when you said that.
So knowing what you know and all your experience, if you were a patient, what kind of things would you be looking for in an IVF lab to choose that lab or that center to move forward with your cycle?
So I think one of the things I would like to know is what the overall level of experience of the staff is. Is there a lot of staff turnover? How long has the program been in existence? How long have the embryologists been working there? And I actually say that as a new embryologist at my current practice. I've been there for less than a year, but I moved practices because, in a way, in some ways, because the reputation of this practice is so good.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like those things do matter. But then if you were to look at me, you would say, okay, she's only been there for a year, right? But the other people that I work with have been there for a long time.
Right.
So it does matter. We always are trying to bring new embryologists into the fold and to train them up. You do want to train them in your specific way of doing things. So it is good to get them young and to train them up. But, you want to know that the lab's, quality control procedures are really good. You want to know that they've passed CAP or JCO inspections.
Mm-hmm.
So usually there's going to be a certificate on the wall somewhere saying that this is a CAP accredited lab or a Joint Commission accredited lab, or so I think all those things are important. And then I also want to know that the lab is using new technologies that are good and proven.
So equip us, like what kind of terms or what kind of questions could we ask that would make us aware that they're using new technology? I mean, what if I were a patient, I'm writing this list down, and I'm going to, for people who are watching this show, this is going to be written up as a blog article. So you can take this, print it out, call the clinics that you're looking at working with, and make sure that they have all these elements for your future, for your future cycle. So what would be a key word that we could use to ask, to find out if they have the latest technology?
Well, I think one of the things that I would like to know is, I think most places have stopped doing biopsy on day 3. So it's usually only day 5, day 6, or day 7 biopsy now. But I'd like to know that they are doing a laser-assisted biopsy.
Mm-hmm.
There are other methods, but the laser is a good, clean cut on the cells, and
and there's a reason lasers are very expensive. So if people are not using the laser, they haven't invested in their lab. And if they haven't invested in the laser, you can imagine they haven't invested in the latest incubators, the latest and best media.
Yeah. And I do think, so it's a little bit of a tough position, because if the lab is a long established lab that is running well and it's getting patients pregnant, and there's no problems with their rates, then it almost doesn't matter what kind of culture systems they're using. They're producing beautiful babies, right? So it's a little hard, but from your perspective, what do you think that patients could ask about the lab? Like, what would you tell your patients if they were asking questions about the lab?
I mean, I know that in the Bay Area and in California in general, people are just so lucky to have the access and so many options to different IVF centers, and they're really all top notch. So, I don't know that necessarily these questions are as useful, let's say in the Bay Area, for example, but in other parts of this country and in California too, sometimes there still are centers who aren't using a laser. They're not, they haven't invested in the technology in the lab. But I mean, for me, it's just one question is how many people work there?
How many
If
people?
it's, I mean, that's a very simple question to ask, because if it's just one person, there might not be the checks and balances in place to make sure that you won't have a wrong embryo transfer or a label issue, or like you said, that chain of custody, the COC, that's so important in the lab, that might not be there if there's just that one person, because how could you if you don't have that second person to double check things? And sometimes there's even 3 people in the lab for certain procedures that check everything, the labels, make sure you're thawing the right embryo, make sure you've labeled the Petri dish correctly, for example.
Sure. And so now there are also electronic witnessing systems, because there are some technologies that are being developed for these smaller labs and even for big labs, right? That we want to be sure that everything we're using is barcoded to the patient. You can scan it in. Another good question to ask would be, I would probably, it's pretty standard across the industry now, but I would want to know that my embryos are the only embryos in that section of the incubator.
Right.
So
that you're not sharing an apartment. You're not roomies with somebody else's embryos.
Absolutely, yeah. And the incubators these days, usually they are they have low oxygen tension.
Mm-hmm.
Usually the oil that the embryology lab is using is it's very clean, and they're buying commercial sources. But another thing that patients might want to know is, are they making reagents themselves, or are they buying them from a commercial source? Again, along those lines. Now, I don't know if the practice is necessarily going to tell people that, but
I mean, I think it's these are very fair questions. And I tell patients, being an IVF doctor is kind of like being in the restaurant business. You kind of know what's going on in other people's restaurants. Like, I know who's doing these things and who has this and who doesn't. But a patient wouldn't know unless they asked. And you're right, you might not get access to the embryologist to ask these questions. And that might be a red flag right there. If people won't, I know the lab directors that I work with, they're just so transparent. If a patient wants to ask these questions, I can do an email introduction with the lab director, and they will personally talk to the patient and answer their questions about all of these things. And a lot of these things are written up as protocols inside the lab, and they're also on the website sometimes, for example, chain of custody and how that is taken care of behind the scenes.
Absolutely. Yeah, great points.
Yeah. So let's go back to our questions. I can never talk about this stuff enough. So thank you for your time. I know we've been talking for a while, but I can keep going. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely.
Okay, here we go. To freeze or not to freeze? That is the question. What do you think?
Okay, so a little outside of my area, because now we're bringing in the endometrium and the home that the embryo is going into. So, obviously, to say it again, nothing I say here should be taken as medical advice.
Right. We're just here for educational purposes only, just so people know what questions to ask their doctor. Of course, no one's going to sue us for our conversation.
Yep. So from what we have seen in studies is that when you take all these drugs to stimulate your ovaries, the whole body is active in this process. Mm-hmm. And what seems to be the best way is to let the body come back down, prepare the endometrium separately, freeze all the embryos, and then transfer one single genetically normal embryo back at a later time. But there are certain patients where some practices are still doing, a day 3 fresh transfer. So that would be, just a few days after the egg retrieval.
Right.
But, I almost want to say that when you're doing a fresh transfer like that, it's almost kind of like a last ditch effort. Like with an Olympic athlete, you're shaving seconds off of your time. And sometimes that is the way that we're practicing IVF and reproductive medicine, is we're like, it probably wouldn't be good for the normal person to do what an Olympic athlete does, but what do I need to do to get this patient to the finish line?
Right.
And so occasionally, the thought is that in some cases, some certain cases, age-related or related to the different why the person's being treated for infertility, that it might be better, the embryo might be better off inside of them at day 3 than in the lab until day 5.
Right.
So,
or a fresh transfer on day 5 too, based on their personal story. So what I'm hearing from you is basically freezing an embryo isn't going to harm your chances of pregnancy if you're in a top-notch lab.
Sure, and it even looks like these all strategies are increasing the pregnancy rate in a lot of places.
Right. So you cut out just for a second there. So freezing and thawing the embryo can improve pregnancy rates in certain. That's something that some centers have noticed.
Yes, and there have been that the freeze-all strategy is improving pregnancy rates.
Right. So freezing embryos has been improving pregnancy rates in several studies. That's absolutely true. Okay, so with freezing embryos, then you're dealing with storage of embryos, and we've all heard of a lot of these sad stories about storage issues with tanks and tank failures. And so, I have patients that are very nervous about the tanks, not so much now in 2020 as, for example, 2018 in the beginning. And, we don't hear those questions as much. But have things changed as far as how people are taking care of embryos in tanks to make sure that those kinds of things don't happen anymore?
Well, so I should say that many, many years went by and there were never any tank failures or anything like this happen. There were 2 highly publicized events. They happened at good labs to good people. They could happen to anybody. It is really terrifying for all of us in the field to think that something like that could happen. And I don't know specifics, but I do know that, in one of the cases, it was a catastrophic failure of the device that nobody could have predicted. And I don't know if a lot of people know this, but liquid nitrogen is minus 180 degrees. And as a gas, when you cool a gas off, you condense it. And when that gas warms up, it expands. So liquid nitrogen can expand to 7 times the size. So if you were to warm a bunch of liquid nitrogen up, you actually created a missile out of your tank, a bullet, a bomb. The explosion is significant. And it's one of the fears that everybody has, because a liquid nitrogen dewar where the embryos are kept, think of your thermos that you put hot soup in. That thermos has a vacuum that's keeping your soup hot. And the dewar is the exact same thing. It has a vacuum that's keeping those freezing, extra freezing cold temperatures in there. And those freezing cold temperatures can break, many, many things. So the seal of a vacuum is, but like I said, in general, very safe. We went 30 or 40 years without anything like that ever happening. So of course, we worry about manufacturing defects. We worry about all of those things. And in other cases, there are ways to fill the tank automatically with more liquid nitrogen. And if those pieces malfunction, which, you're dealing with ice crystals, and again, these freezing cold temperatures, they can break down mechanical components. So I think what everybody's doing now is visually inspecting the tanks more than 1 time a day. So in the morning when you get in, visually inspecting, at night before you leave, visually inspecting, as well as we're measuring the liquid nitrogen level itself with a long ruler. And so that would be every tank. You're recording it several times a week. You have this schedule that you're filling tanks on. There are alarm systems on every tank. And then there are some new technologies as well that are thermal imaging cameras, where you can see your whole cryo storage inventory on your phone and on and out. So if there are any cold spots, the tank that's about to fail, you can visually see it with a thermal imaging camera. And then I think the other technology now that's being developed is an actual weight system, so a weighing system.
Like a scale of some sort.
Like a scale of some sort, but for these, heavy nitrogen dewars that are also very sensitive, so that they can detect just a little bit of evaporation of liquid nitrogen. That way it can try to give us as much notice as possible. So
what you're saying, you were cutting out just a little bit there for people who didn't hear.
My friends in the field, what I've seen, I'll start again. So what I've seen kind of talking to my friends in the field is that people are using now combinations of all of these strategies. We don't want to rely on any one thing. There's human error, there's failure of equipment, there's just a variety of things that can happen. And so you want to have multiple monitoring systems to catch any one of those things from happening.
So maybe one question someone can ask of their doctor before, to feel like they really feel like this is the right fit for them is, what kind of monitoring systems do you have in place for your tanks? That's a totally fair question.
Sure.
Absolutely. Cool. So just bear with me, just a few more questions. I would love to hear from you. You have so much experience, so this is a very valuable conversation for our listeners. So what do you see in the future in the IVF embryology world? 5, 10, 15 years from now, what do we have to look forward to? And I know some of your research and some of the stuff that you've talked about is related to AI. So I would love to hear what you think about what's to come.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that is in development right now is being able to do fertility preservation by taking a slice of ovary itself, maybe with a lot of eggs in it that are immature, and freezing that slice of ovary, and then at some point in the future, maturing those eggs.
Wow.
So all those pieces, how do you freeze a slice of tissue? How do you, can you graft it back onto the patient at a later date? When you thaw it, how do you thaw it? How do you graft it?
Right.
Can you mature the eggs in the lab? All of
Can
those
can it reverse my menopause? That would be
yeah.
nice.
Oh,
Put it
yeah.
in my ovary, put it in me when I'm 50. Let me do it when I'm 20, and then maybe I don't have to have menopause, right? I mean, that's what I'm thinking. But yeah, from a fertility standpoint, that sounds incredible.
Yeah. And so that I would say is a big area of research. Another big area of research is, can we create embryos from two of the same gendered people?
Mm-hmm.
And does the body contain any stem cells that we can coax into becoming an egg or a sperm? Or can you use a patient's skin cells and have them go backward to be embryonic stem cells, and then forward again, instead of being skin, they become an egg cell or a sperm cell?
So do you see that happening next 20 years? I mean, do you think that's something that could really happen? I mean, I think it would be great. I'd love to never have to freeze eggs for somebody and have them go through stem and hormones. It'd be really cool to be like, here, come, or go see the dermatologist for your skin biopsy.
Yeah, it's realistic right now in animal models.
Wow.
And, it's probably a long way off from happening in humans, maybe 5 or 10 years, but these fields move incredibly quickly.
Yeah.
You never know what the next breakthrough is going to be that will enable that technology to suddenly be deployed on a mass scale to patients,
Right.
Yeah. So those are some of the things. I think one of the hot areas of research is sperm fragmentation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that is just, becoming more well known. And there are, I think a lot of times the men kind of get left out of the equation, but they're 30% of the infertility, right?
Right.
And
right.
as men are aging, their sperm is aging too, and the DNA inside of it is aging. And even sometimes in young men, we can see high DNA fragmentation in sperm due to lifestyle or environmental factors, or possibly even things that we haven't even begun to figure out yet.
Right.
So that's a really hot area, sperm processing. And you were mentioning artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence is being applied all throughout our world now. Self-driving cars. You know, when your credit card pings you that there's been some activity on it that is outside your normal spending, that's artificial intelligence at work. And it's being applied to the medical field. A lot of the applications right now are in cancer. So being able to look through a lot of radio imaging to see, is that a normal lump or is that cancer, which doesn't fit. And so the computer in artificial intelligence is uniquely good at solving problems like that, because the human eye takes 20 or 30 years of training, whereas the computer might actually see something that is completely unknown to humans, but it has studied so many outcomes, like did this turn into an invasive cancer? So do we have time for an analogy?
Oh, please. I love analogies, and I'm trying to always, I suck at them. I mean, go for it.
Okay, so I like to describe artificial intelligence as taking two pieces of colored paper and crumpling them together. You have crumpled something into this very, very complex structure, and you know that at one time it existed as two separate pieces of paper. But how do you uncrumple those papers, right? So the embryo not the embryo, but let's say a live, healthy birth, that is our crumpled ball of paper. What we want the computer to do is work backwards through all of those, unfolding that crumple one layer at a time until we have the flat pieces of paper that make up our patient's embryos, our patient's demographics, and our patient's history, and our patient's infertility diagnosis. And we want to be able to put all of those together to get some kind of a what I and all of my colleagues would like to see is actually, we want the computers to tell us something we don't know. So we are pretty good at getting patients pregnant, but there are still some cases of repeated failure of implantation, or where we're just not making embryos. The stem needs to be, tweaked a lot to get some good quality eggs to make some embryos with, or the embryos are not making it to blastocyst, or we're implanting them and the patient's not getting pregnant. There's a whole bunch of different things. And that we really would love to apply artificial intelligence to these big intractable problems in human embryology.
Yeah. Do you think we're ever going to get to a point where we're going to be able to culture embryos past day 7?
Yes, so we can now to day 14 in the lab, but we can't culture embryos past day 14. And at some point, the embryo needs to act like it has implanted in the endometrium. And so now it's being done experimentally to day 14, but due to international agreement and local laws, you're not allowed to culture any embryo past day 14. So I think that the technology could get there, but right now legally the experiments can't be done. But I've definitely had patients ask, why do I need a gestational carrier? Why can't you just grow the embryo in the lab?
Right. Well, again, thank you, Carol, for joining us. For those of you who don't know and didn't hear her credentials, she's a senior clinical embryologist. She has her PhD, her research focused in animal cloning, her postdoc fellowship in human embryonic stem cell research, and we've had a great conversation today. We talked about her career, her personal pregnancy journey. We talked about all the things that you as a patient could ask a clinic to feel empowered to know that your IVF lab is top-notch. We talked about lots of controversial questions in the embryology world. For example, does ICSI cause birth defects? Should we transfer mosaic embryos? Is fresh versus frozen better? What's going on with PGT? Is non-invasive PGT in our future? And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about the future of embryology and what your predictions are for the future. This conversation has been super informative. When something's informative for me, I hope it doesn't make those out there snore, because I could literally talk about this all night long. And I know we're not going to. We're going to end this show very soon, but I just wanted to say thank you for doing the work that you do. Thank you for being as passionate as I am. I mean, I'm like the most annoyingly positive person in the whole world. Like, you don't get more annoying than me. And to know that there's someone like you, you're not annoying, but you're extremely passionate about what you do. You're incredibly intelligent. So it just makes me so happy to know that there are people out there just like you. And I know that others watching this show, we should be excited about our future. We shouldn't let the pandemic take away our joy. We shouldn't let the pandemic take away our fertility.
Absolutely.
And there's always hope. There's a future. You and I have our boats. We're all in the storm together, and we're throwing out our life vests to all those patients out there. And because of people like you and the research that you're doing, there is a better future in the IVF lab, in the IVF world. And I imagine you would agree that there are patients that you'll be able to help in a year from now that maybe we couldn't help 5 years ago.
That is true.
It is true.
And I also want to say, we can't wait to get back in the lab for our patients, but also that they're worth the wait. They're worth the wait for us to make sure that we're all doing this safely for everybody's best interest.
Yeah.
And we're going to get back up and going again soon.
Yeah, and I mean, that's what I was going to ask you to do is, before we close the show, if you had a fertility patient standing right in front of you right now and you had one thing to say to them, what would that be?
Well, I think it would be just that your health is my top priority, and your future family, keeping you healthy so that you can have that future family, is my top priority. I know there's a lot of concerns about whether egg quality can change in just a few weeks. I'm not aware of any studies showing that egg quality can change in just 1 month or 2 months' time. I understand people might start getting a bit afraid of, 6 months delay or a year delay, but we're, right now we're still in that period where if they were on a treatment course before, we're going to stay the course, and egg quality can vary from cycle to cycle anyway. And, there are so many things patients can be doing right now to prepare their body and to prepare their health, to make sure that, when we do have the retrieval, it's going to be the best retrieval possible, and that their body is in tip-top condition, and really having their lungs and heart stay healthy for that eventual transfer that's where we want our patients to be.
Mm-hmm.
But I think now we're starting to see practices are preparing to open back up. You have states that are now coming through and saying that, these procedures can start to move forward, and all of our practices are talking about ways that we can open up safely. We can distance our patients, distance the time in between procedures, limit how many people are in the office on a certain day. We're rotating embryology teams so that if anybody does get sick, it doesn't take down the whole team. So like you were saying, hopefully there will never just be one person healthy, looking after the embryos. So, and I know that now at this time, we're all antsy to get back to it, and we want to start seeing patients again.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you. Those are great closing words. Thank you for joining us on the Egg Whisperer Show, talking about the latest and greatest in the embryology lab and getting your input on all the stuff we talked about. Thank you for all you do. And thank you to all the viewers. Hopefully you'll join us again next week for our next show. And everyone, have a great night. We'll see you guys later. Yeah. Bye-bye. Bye, Doc.
Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show, a program exclusively designed to promote reproductive health awareness and discuss fertility preservation options. Here is your host, the Harvard-educated fertility specialist, Dr. Aimee.
She's known as the Egg Whisperer. Fertility expert Dr. Aimee,
And you have yet another success story
just launched by an East Bay fertility doctor.